Give the king Evelyn. Isabella is worth too much to lose. The words came through the council chamber door so clearly that Evelyn Miller forgot how to breathe. She stood alone in the corridor, one hand still raised toward the brass handle, the white sleeve of her dress trembling against her wrist. Inside, her father did not object. He only asked, "And Blackwood will forgive the entire debt?" A second voice answered, dry and official. 30,000 silver crowns. 3 border estates remain under Miller control. Your military penalties are cancelled once the marriage contract is signed. Eve lowered her hand. 30,000 silver crowns. 3 estates. A cancelled debt. Apparently, that was what a daughter was worth. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. If you believe that kindness is power, hit like and subscribe. These stories remind us love redeems the broken. Now, back to Evelyn. She should have walked away. Instead, she remained beside the door, listening as her life became a negotiation. Isabella cannot go, Margaret Miller said. Eve's stepmother sounded almost offended by the possibility. She has prospects. Lord Harrington's son has already expressed interest. And Evelyn, the royal envoy asked. A pause followed. Eve knew that pause. She had lived inside it for 22 years. It was the silence people used when trying to find something valuable to say about her. Evelyn is an Omega, Margaret finally replied. Quiet. Obedient. She won't cause trouble. Eve stared at the stone floor. Quiet. Obedient. Not kind. Not loyal. Not the daughter who had spent 3 winters tending sick villagers when Margaret refused to open the manor stores. Not the girl who had given Isabella her own medicine during the red fever outbreak. Quiet and obedient. Those were apparently the qualities that made someone easy to sell. Does she know? The envoy asked. Her father gave a humorless laugh. She will. Eve pushed the door open. Every face turned toward her. Richard Miller sat at the head of the long oak table. Margaret occupied the chair beside him, perfectly composed in dark green velvet. Isabella lounged near the fire, golden hair shining in the afternoon light. None of them looked ashamed. Only the envoy, an elderly man wearing Blackwood silver and black, lowered his eyes. A parchment lay open on the table. Eve saw her full name before anyone could cover it. Evelyn Rose Miller. Beneath it were columns of numbers. 30,000 silver crowns. She walked closer. So it's true. Richard leaned back. You should have knocked. Would the price have changed if I had? Isabella sighed. Don't be dramatic, Eve. Eve looked at her sister. Would you say that if your name were on the contract? Isabella's expression hardened. Margaret rose. Enough. This arrangement saves our family. Which member of it? Eve asked. Her father slammed one palm against the table. The sound made her flinch before she could stop herself. You will marry Alexander Blackwood. Even his name changed the room. The Black Wolf King. Alpha King Alexander Blackwood. Stories about him traveled farther than his armies. They said his violet eyes could force seasoned wolves to lower their heads. They said traitors begged before him and received no mercy. They said he had once ended a rebellion before sunrise and eaten breakfast while the rebel banners were still burning. Eve had never seen him. She had still learned to fear him. Why does he want me? She asked. He wants an alliance, Richard said. The crown requires a bride from House Miller. Eve looked toward Isabella. Understanding arrived quietly. And you chose me. Margaret approached and adjusted the collar of Eve's white dress as though preparing a servant for inspection. Isabella has a future here. Eve looked into her stepmother's eyes. And I don't. Margaret's fingers stopped. She offered no answer. Somehow, that hurt more than cruelty would have. Eve turned toward the parchment. One clause caught her attention. If House Miller failed to provide the promised bride, the crown could seize the 3 border estates and collect the remaining debt through pack labor. Eve's stomach tightened. Pack labor. She knew what that meant. Families who already had almost nothing would lose sons to mines, daughters to noble households, winters to debts they had never created. Richard had gambled away the treasury. The pack would pay for it. Unless Eve did. If I sign, she said, the debt ends. The envoy nodded carefully. Under the stated terms. No additional collection from the village families? None. Richard frowned. Evelyn, this is not a negotiation for you to Eve picked up the quill. Then make it one. For the first time, her father fell silent. She dipped the tip into black ink. Her hand trembled above the parchment. She imagined Blackwood Castle somewhere beyond the northern mountains. Black stone. Snow. A ruthless king with glowing violet eyes waiting for a bride he had purchased from strangers. Fear pressed cold fingers against her ribs. Then she remembered the children in the lower village sharing one loaf between 4 mouths. She remembered mothers hiding grain whenever Miller tax riders approached. Eve placed the quill against the page. Evelyn Rose Miller. Her signature looked strangely beautiful beneath the price of her life. The envoy slowly rolled the contract closed. Isabella released a relieved breath. Margaret touched Eve's shoulder. You have finally done something important for this family. Eve looked at the hand resting on her, then gently removed it. No, she said. Her voice was soft, but it did not break. I did it for everyone your family would have made pay instead. Richard's face darkened. Eve turned and walked toward the door. Where are you going? He demanded. She stopped without looking back. To pack. You leave at dawn. Eve glanced over her shoulder, luminous blue eyes steady despite the fear twisting inside her. I know. Then she stepped into the corridor and closed the council chamber behind her. Only once she was alone did her composure crack. Her fingers covered her mouth. One tear slipped down her cheek. Tomorrow, she would belong to the most feared Alpha King in the realm. But as Eve stood in the cold corridor listening to her family discuss the fortune her marriage had saved them, one terrible truth settled inside her. She was not afraid because they were sending her away. She was afraid because not one of them had asked her to stay. If he sends you back, don't come home. Isabella said it while fastening the silver clasp at Evelyn's throat. Eve stared at her sister through the bedroom mirror, unsure which hurt more, the words themselves or the casual way Isabella delivered them. Morning light spilled through the narrow windows of Miller Manor, pale and cold against the white fantasy gown Margaret had chosen for her. Silver embroidery traced the fitted sleeves and bodice. A winter cloak rested over her shoulders. Her long chestnut brown hair had been brushed until it shone. She looked less like a daughter preparing to leave home and more like an offering carefully wrapped for delivery. Isabella, Eve whispered. Her sister stepped back to inspect her. What? Father said this alliance has to work. If Blackwood rejects you, everyone will blame us. Eve looked down at her hands. I meant, is that really all you have to say? Isabella's expression shifted, but only briefly. What would you like me to say? Goodbye would have been enough. Eve swallowed the answer. A knock came at the door and Margaret entered without waiting. Her eyes traveled immediately over Eve's clothes. Stand straight. Eve obeyed automatically. Margaret adjusted the cloak, smoothed one wrinkle from the skirt, then tilted Eve's chin toward the light. You look acceptable. Acceptable. Eve almost laughed. 22 years in this house, and even on the morning she was being sold to save it, acceptable was the best her stepmother could offer. The carriage is waiting, Margaret continued. The Blackwood escort arrived before sunrise. Will father come down? Eve asked. Margaret hesitated. He has council business. Something inside Eve went very quiet. Of course. She picked up the small leather bag containing everything she had been allowed to take. Isabella glanced at it. That's all. Most of my things apparently belong to House Miller. Technically, they do. Eve looked at her sister. Isabella had the grace to look away. They descended the staircase together. Servants stood along the hall, many with lowered eyes. An elderly kitchen maid named Martha pressed a wrapped loaf into Eve's hands as she passed. For the road, miss. Eve smiled, and suddenly her eyes burned. Thank you. Martha squeezed her fingers. It was the first affectionate touch anyone had given her that morning. Outside, 6 Blackwood riders waited beside a dark carriage. Their armor was black, edged in silver, each breastplate marked with the crowned wolf of the Alpha King. Eve's pulse quickened at the sight. The captain bowed. Lady Evelyn. We leave immediately. Richard finally appeared at the manor entrance. Relief rose foolishly inside her. Perhaps he had come to say goodbye after all. He walked down the steps and stopped before her. Remember why you are there. Eve waited. Do not challenge him. Do not embarrass this house. And whatever Alexander Blackwood asks of you, think of the consequences before refusing. The relief died. Is that fatherly advice? Richard's eyes narrowed. It is practical advice. I see. He handed the captain a sealed document. Not Eve. The captain. The final marriage terms. Eve noticed another parchment tucked beneath it. What changed? Richard's hand tightened. Nothing that concerns you. Eve reached for the document. He pulled it away. You signed yesterday. I signed yesterday's terms. Evelyn. The warning in his voice was familiar. For most of her life, it had been enough to make her retreat. Today, Eve remained still. What changed? Richard glanced toward the Blackwood guards. His embarrassment mattered more than her fear. It always had. Additional assurances, he muttered. Your obedience to the crown. Marital obligations. Matters necessary to ensure the alliance cannot be dissolved because you become difficult. Eve felt the cold morning air enter her lungs and refused to leave. You added those after I signed? I protected this family. By promising things that were never yours to promise? Richard stepped closer. Do not start pretending you have choices now. The words landed cleanly. No shouting. No anger. Somehow that made them crueler. Eve looked past him at Margaret and Isabella standing beneath the manor arch. Neither spoke. Neither objected. She understood then that yesterday's contract had not been the moment her family sold her. They had been doing it in smaller ways her entire life, trading her comfort for Isabella's, her labor for their convenience, her silence for peace. Yesterday had merely put a price beside the habit. Eve climbed into the carriage. No one embraced her. No one asked if she was frightened. When the wheels began moving, she watched Miller Manor shrink through the window until the house disappeared behind bare winter trees. Only then did she open Martha's bread. Inside the cloth was a tiny sprig of dried lavender and a note. You were always worth more than they knew. Eve pressed the paper against her chest and closed her eyes. Hours became a day. Then another. The familiar Miller countryside gave way to northern forests and snow-covered mountains. Villages grew quieter as the Blackwood border approached. Whenever people saw the Crown Wolf banners, they stepped aside. Some bowed. Others simply watched. Eve remembered every story about Alexander Blackwood. Ruthless. Merciless. The Black Wolf King. By the third afternoon, Blackwood Castle appeared through falling snow, enormous black towers rising from the mountain like something carved from night. Hundreds of wolves and soldiers waited inside the courtyard. The carriage stopped. Eve's hands went cold. The captain opened the door. Lady Evelyn. She stepped down into the snow. Silence spread across the courtyard. Then the castle doors opened. A man descended the stone steps. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Black medieval armor fitted over a powerful frame, a dark royal cloak moving behind him in the wind. Short black hair framed an angular, striking face. His expression was cold enough to match the mountains. But it was his eyes that held Eve motionless. Violet. Bright, unnatural violet. Alpha King Alexander Blackwood stopped directly before her. Every wolf around them lowered their head. Eve forced herself not to. His gaze moved across her face, then toward the sealed papers carried by his captain. The Miller contract? Yes, Your Majesty. Alexander broke the seal. He read silently. Eve watched his expression harden when he reached the added clauses. His violet eyes lifted to Richard's signature, then to hers. This handwriting is different. Eve's heart stumbled. Alexander looked directly at her. Not through her. Not at her dress. At her. Did you agree to these additional terms? No one had asked her that. Not once. Eve opened her mouth, but no sound came. Alexander waited. The entire courtyard waited with him. Finally, Eve whispered, "Does it matter?" Something dangerous entered the Alpha King's face. But the anger was not directed at her. To me, he said, folding the contract slowly, it matters very much. No one will touch you under my roof unless you choose it. Alexander Blackwood spoke the words so calmly that Eve wondered if she had misunderstood him. Snow drifted through the Blackwood courtyard, settling along the shoulders of his black armor, while soldiers stood in absolute silence around them. The altered marriage contract remained in his hand. Eve could still see her father's signature beneath the clauses she had never approved. Obedience to the crown. Marital obligations. Language designed to make refusal impossible. Alexander looked at the Blackwood captain. Who delivered this version? Lord Miller, Your Majesty. After Lady Evelyn signed the original? Yes. Alexander's violet eyes turned colder. Send a writer back. Eve's pulse jumped. Wait. His attention returned to her immediately. If you punish my father, the pack will suffer for it. Your father forged your consent. I know. And you are protecting him? No, Eve swallowed. I'm protecting everyone beneath him. Something shifted in Alexander's expression. He studied her for several seconds before looking at the contract again. Then he reached toward his belt. Eve flinched when he drew a knife. Alexander noticed. His hand stopped. The entire courtyard seemed to stop with it. He slowly lowered the blade away from her and placed the contract against the stone railing beside them. Watch. He slid the knife through the parchment. Once. Twice. The section containing Richard's additional terms separated from the rest and fell onto the snow. Eve stared at it. Alexander turned to his captain. The crown recognizes only the agreement Lady Evelyn signed. Yes, Your Majesty. Send that message to House Miller. No punishment against the pack. No additional levy. He glanced down at the severed clauses. But inform Richard Miller that if he attempts to forge his daughter's consent again, he will answer to me personally. Eve could not speak. Alexander sheathed the knife. The original treaty remains because the crown requires the alliance. The wedding proceeds tomorrow night. There it was. Reality returning. She was still expected to marry him. Alexander was still the Ruthless Alpha King whose name frightened entire territories. Yet the paper at her feet had been cut apart because she had not agreed to it. Eve looked up. Why? Why what? Why do you care whether I agreed? A faint crease appeared between his brows, as though the question itself disturbed him. Because you are a person. For ordinary words. They struck somewhere Eve had spent years teaching herself not to feel. Her father had called her an obligation. Margaret called her useful when she obeyed. Isabella measured Eve's worth by what she could surrender. Alexander Blackwood had known her for less than 5 minutes. Because you are a person. Eve lowered her eyes before he could see them shine. Come inside, he said. You're freezing. He turned toward the castle. Eve hesitated. Alexander noticed without looking back. He stopped at the first step instead of ordering her to follow. That unsettled her almost as much as everything else. Eve finally walked after him. Inside, Blackwood Castle was nothing like the place she had imagined. It was dark, yes, black stone, iron chandeliers, enormous fireplaces, but it was not cruel. Servants moved without panic. Guards spoke quietly to one another. A kitchen boy nearly collided with Alexander while carrying a basket of apples. The child froze. Eve expected anger. Alexander simply stepped aside. Slow down on the stairs. Yes, Your Majesty. The boy hurried away. Eve stared. Alexander caught her looking. What? Nothing. That was clearly something. I was told servants avoided being seen by you. Then whoever told you that has never lived here. Eve almost said, my family. Instead, she remained silent. They reached a long corridor overlooking the snowy valley. A woman in gray approached and bowed. Lady Evelyn, I'm Mrs. Hale. I oversee the royal household. Her smile was restrained but warm. Your rooms are prepared. Rooms. Plural. Eve looked at Alexander. He gave no explanation. Mrs. Hale led them to carved wooden doors at the eastern end of the corridor. Inside was a large chamber warmed by a fire, with tall windows overlooking the forest. A second door connected to a smaller sitting room. Eve's travel bag had already been placed beside the bed. Nothing else from Miller Manor had followed her. Alexander remained at the threshold. He did not enter. Is something wrong? Eve asked. No, then why are you standing there? Because these are your rooms. She frowned. But this is your castle. Those statements do not contradict each other. Eve looked toward the bed, then back at him. Understanding arrived slowly. Where will you sleep after the wedding? In my rooms. And I stay here? Unless you request otherwise. Her chest tightened. My father promised, your father promised things that were not his. Alexander's voice hardened, but again, never toward her. The treaty gives me a wife before the law. It does not give me ownership of your body. Eve stared at him. She had prepared herself during the 3-day journey for fear. For obedience. For surviving whatever the Black Wolf King demanded. She had not prepared for boundaries. What if I refuse you? She asked. Alexander's face became unreadable. Then I hear the word no. That's all. What else should happen? Eve could think of too many answers. Apparently, her silence gave him one. His gaze sharpened, settling on the way her fingers had curled into her skirt. Who taught you otherwise? She looked away. It doesn't matter. It mattered enough to make you afraid. You don't know me. No, Alexander's voice softened by a fraction. Which is why I will not pretend I know what you need. He reached into his cloak and placed a small iron key on the table just inside the doorway. The bedroom locks from your side. Eve looked at the key. Who else has one? No one. Not even you? His violet eyes held hers. Especially me. Alexander stepped backward. No touch. No command. Mrs. Hale will bring dinner. Tomorrow, you may ask me anything you wish about the marriage before the ceremony. He turned away. Eve found her voice. Alexander. The Alpha King stopped. It was the first time she had used his name. People say you're ruthless. He looked over his shoulder, black cloak falling behind him like a shadow. Sometimes they are correct. Should I be afraid of you? For several seconds, he said nothing. You should decide that from what I do, he answered, not from what people tell you I am. Then he walked away. Eve closed the door. Her hand hovered over the iron key. Slowly, almost disbelievingly, she turned it. The lock clicked from her side. And for the first time in her life, Evelyn Miller stood behind a locked door and understood that the person outside it had given her the power to keep him out. If you wish to stop the ceremony tomorrow, say so before the final vow. Eve stared at Alexander across the long dining table, certain she had heard him incorrectly. Outside the tall windows, snow swept across Blackwood Castle beneath a moonless sky. Candlelight glimmered against his black armor and caught in his violet eyes, making them appear almost luminous. Stop the ceremony, she repeated. Alexander set down his cup. Yes. And what happens to the treaty? I deal with it. My father's debt? Remains a matter between the Crown and Richard Miller. Eve's fingers tightened around her spoon. The villages? Alexander noticed the question immediately. Will not be punished for his decisions. She searched his face for the hidden condition. There had always been one at Miller Manor. Kindness came with an invoice. Forgiveness waited to be collected later. Why would you do that? Because marrying me and protecting innocent people should not have to be the same decision. Eve looked down at her untouched soup. She had spent the journey north preparing herself to survive a ruthless king. Alexander kept ruining that preparation. The next evening, Blackwood's great hall burned gold beneath hundreds of candles. Wolves from every northern territory filled the galleries. Nobles stood beneath black and silver banners bearing the crowned wolf. Eve waited at the entrance in the same white gown, silver embroidery catching the light, her long chestnut hair falling over her shoulders. At the far end stood Alexander. Black armor. Dark royal cloak. Cold, commanding stillness. Every story about him suddenly seemed possible. As Eve entered, conversations died one by one. She felt hundreds of eyes measure her. The unwanted Omega daughter. The bride purchased from a failing house. Her steps became heavier. Halfway down the aisle, she almost stopped. Alexander noticed. He did not move toward her. He did not command her forward. He simply waited. Eve remembered his words. Say so before the final vow. She could stop. The knowledge steadied her more than any order could have. She continued walking. When she reached him, Alexander extended his hand but did not take hers. Eve looked at it, then deliberately placed her fingers in his. His hand closed carefully around them. Warm. Controlled. Certain, he murmured, too quietly for the court to hear. Eve looked into those unnatural violet eyes. No, something almost like understanding softened his face. Neither am I. Eve blinked. You're the Alpha King. That does not make me immune to bad decisions. Despite herself, a tiny laugh escaped her. Several nobles looked scandalized. Alexander's mouth almost curved. The officiant began. The vows were older than Blackwood Castle, speaking of winter and bloodlines, loyalty and protection. When Eve's turn came, her voice trembled only once. Alexander's did not. Yet when he slid the dark silver ring onto her finger, he did it slowly enough for her to pull away. She didn't. The hall erupted with applause. Eve barely heard it. Wife. Queen. The words felt too large for her body. Hours later, after the feast finally ended, Eve stood outside her chamber while servants disappeared down the corridor. Alexander had walked her there himself. Her heartbeat became painfully loud. This was the part Margaret had warned her about. The part Richard had attempted to guarantee in writing. Alexander reached for something inside his cloak. Eve stiffened. He withdrew an iron key, the same kind as the one already resting inside her room. He placed it in her palm. This opens the inner sitting room and the balcony door. Eve stared at it. And your room? West Tower. Across the castle? Yes. Confusion overcame fear. We were married 3 hours ago. I was there. Alexander. Evelyn. She almost smiled, then caught herself. People will expect you to stay here. People expect many things from me. And that doesn't bother you? His violet eyes cooled. Very little bothers me enough to surrender my judgment to gossip. Eve looked through the open doorway at the enormous bed. What if the court questions whether the marriage is real? Let them. The treaty is signed. He paused. Your room remains yours. Eve turned the key between her fingers. No guards. Not unless you request them. Servants. They knock. She hesitated. And you? Alexander's expression did not change. Especially me. The same answer as yesterday. Somehow it affected her more tonight. Eve stepped into the chamber, but her sleeve caught a decorative vase on the small table beside the doorway. Porcelain struck stone. It shattered. The sound cracked through the corridor. Eve froze. Her body reacted before thought. She dropped immediately to her knees. I'm sorry. Alexander stared at her. Eve began gathering the pieces with bare hands. I'll replace it. I can work off the cost. Please, I didn't mean Evelyn. She reached for another shard. Alexander crouched and caught her wrist. Eve flinched violently. His hand opened at once. He released her as though burned. Silence. Eve stared at him, embarrassed by her own reaction. I'm sorry, she whispered again. Alexander looked from her face to the broken porcelain. Why? I broke it. It's a vase. It looked expensive. It was. Eve's breath caught. Alexander picked up one large piece and placed it safely on the table. And it remains a vase. She frowned. It's broken. Then tomorrow it will be a broken vase. His gaze settled on her trembling fingers. It will not become a reason to hurt you. Eve could not answer. Alexander's eyes sharpened. Did someone? Her throat tightened. What? Hurt you for breaking things. She looked away. That was enough. Alexander stood slowly. His face became colder than she had seen it all evening, but the anger was directed somewhere far beyond the room. At Miller Manor? It doesn't matter anymore. It matters to you. Eve hated how quickly her eyes filled. People become angry when I cost them something. Alexander looked at the shattered porcelain between them. Then at her. Then they valued objects more than they valued you. The words found a place inside Eve no one had ever touched. Her vision blurred. She turned away before he could see the first tear fall. Alexander did not reach for her. He did not tell her to stop crying. He simply stepped into the corridor and pulled the door almost closed behind him. Good night, Evelyn. She looked back. Alexander. He paused. Eve glanced at the broken vase. Aren't you angry? His expression softened by the smallest degree. Not with you. The door closed. Eve turned the lock. Then she sat beside the shattered porcelain and covered her mouth as years of carefully swallowed tears finally escaped. She had been married to the Ruthless Alpha King for less than one night. And somehow, the monster everyone had taught her to fear had become the first person who made her feel safe enough to cry. "Your Majesty, the prisoner says he stole the grain because his children were starving." Eve stopped outside the council chamber. Alexander's answer came through the half-open doors. "Then he is not the man I want punished." 3 weeks had passed since their wedding, and Eve was still learning that the Black Wolf King rarely behaved the way his reputation promised. She stepped quietly inside. Alexander stood at the end of a long stone table, still wearing the same black armor and dark royal cloak that made him look carved from the shadows of the castle itself. 2 guards held a thin farmer near the doorway. The man's face was pale with fear. A richly dressed noble stood opposite him. "The law is clear," the noble insisted. "He stole 3 sacks from my storehouse." Alexander looked at the farmer. "Why?" "My village ration was cut, Your Majesty." "By whom?" The farmer hesitated. Alexander turned toward the noble. The man's confidence disappeared. "Lord Barrett. There were shortages. Blackwood delivered enough winter grain to your district 6 weeks ago." Alexander's voice remained calm. Somehow, that made it more frightening. "Where is it?" Barrett swallowed. "Storage losses." Alexander placed a ledger on the table. "Interesting. My auditors found those losses being sold across the southern border at 4 times the crown price." Silence. Eve watched from near the wall. This was the ruthless king her family had warned her about. But the farmer was not the one trembling anymore. "Strip Barrett of his winter authority," Alexander ordered. "Open his storehouses before sunset. Every village receives its missing ration." Barrett went white. "Your Majesty, and repay the farmer for the 3 sacks he was forced to steal." Alexander's violet eyes hardened. "From your personal estate. You cannot humiliate a noble over an Omega farmer." The room changed. Eve felt it before she understood it. Alexander did not raise his voice. "Would you prefer I punish you for saying that instead?" Barrett lowered his head. "No, Your Majesty." "Good choice." Alexander dismissed the guards. The farmer stared at him. "I stole from your kingdom. You fed your children with grain already owed to them." Alexander glanced toward the doors. "Go home." The farmer left almost stumbling with relief. Only then did Alexander notice Eve. "How long have you been standing there?" "Long enough to discover the terrifying Black Wolf King apparently has accountants." One of the councilmen coughed to hide a laugh. Alexander's mouth shifted by the smallest degree. "Accountants are terrifying. I will remember that." Eve walked beside him when the council ended. She had begun doing that without thinking. Blackwood Castle no longer felt entirely foreign. Servants greeted her by name. Mrs. Hale had discovered Eve preferred lavender tea. Guards stopped bowing quite so stiffly when she passed. And every night, Eve locked her own bedroom door. Alexander had never once tested it. They crossed the lower courtyard where soldiers were finishing their evening meal. Eve noticed Alexander slow beside the serving tables. "Is something wrong? Have the Western patrols eaten?" he asked a captain. "Not yet, Your Majesty. They return within the hour." Alexander looked at his own untouched dinner being carried toward the royal wing. "Keep mine warm." Eve frowned as they continued. "You haven't eaten since morning." "Neither have they. They are soldiers. They are my soldiers." The distinction settled quietly inside her. At Miller Manor, her father always ate first. The family next. Servants afterward. Villagers whenever something remained. Alexander could command hundreds of wolves with a glance, yet he waited because 7 soldiers were still riding through the snow. Ruthless, Eve thought. Perhaps everyone had simply forgotten to ask whom he was ruthless toward. A crash sounded behind them. A young servant had dropped a silver tray. Cups scattered across the stone. The boy went white and immediately fell to his knees. "Forgive me, Your Majesty." Eve's body tightened. She knew that posture. The lowered head. The frantic breathing. The expectation that pain was already on its way. Alexander stopped. "Are you hurt?" The servant looked confused. "No, Your Majesty." "Then stand up." But the cups, Alexander glanced at them. "Our cups." Eve's breath caught. The words were almost identical to what he had said about her broken vase. The servant slowly rose. Clean them before someone trips. Yes, Your Majesty. Alexander continued walking. Eve remained behind for half a second. He noticed and stopped. What? She looked at him. You really meant it. That is usually why I say things. The vase. Understanding crossed his face. Eve glanced back at the servant collecting silver cups without trembling now. You weren't being kind because I was your wife. Alexander's expression became strangely serious. No, you would have treated anyone that way. Breaking something accidentally is not a moral failure, Evelyn. Such a simple sentence. Yet Eve had spent years believing the opposite. They continued through the corridor. Near the royal wing, Alexander stopped beside a window overlooking the snow-covered training grounds. You have been watching me. Eve flushed. That sounds worse when you say it. Why? She considered lying. Instead, she chose the truth. I'm trying to understand which stories about you are real. And? You did execute 3 traitors last year. Yes. You destroyed the Red Hollow Rebellion. Yes. You imprisoned Lord Carver. He sold military routes to raiders. So you're ruthless. Alexander turned toward her. Violet eyes steady. When necessary. But not toward weakness. His face became unreadable. Eve continued softly, only toward people who use power to hurt those beneath them. Alexander looked through the window. Power has one respectable purpose. What? To make cruelty expensive. Eve stared at him. Before she could answer, Mrs. Hale approached carrying a sealed letter. Your Majesty. This arrived from Miller Manor. Eve recognized her father's crest immediately. Her stomach tightened. Alexander took the letter, but did not open it. He offered it to her. It is addressed to the Queen. Eve almost corrected him. Then she remembered. That was her now. She broke the seal. Richard's handwriting covered the page. No greeting. No question about whether she was safe. Only instructions. House Miller required additional tax relief. Isabella needed a royal invitation to the Winter Court. Richard expected Eve to persuade her husband. At the bottom, one sentence had been underlined. Remember what this family sacrificed to place you where you are. Eve's fingers went cold. Alexander watched her face. What does he want? Something from me. Do you want to give it? Eve looked up, startled by the question. Not what does he demand? Not what must you do? What do you want? She slowly folded the letter. No, Alexander nodded once. Then don't. Eve stared at him as if he had spoken another language. Somewhere deep inside her, a lifetime of obedience shifted slightly out of place. And for the first time, Evelyn began to understand why the Ruthless Alpha King frightened powerful men so much. Alexander Blackwood did not teach the weak to obey. He taught them they were allowed to say no. Your family arrives tomorrow. Alexander's words stopped Eve halfway through lifting her teacup. They were sitting in the smaller royal dining room while snow tapped softly against the windows. For nearly a month, Eve had begun learning the rhythms of Blackwood Castle. Breakfast with Mrs. Hale reminding Alexander to eat. Afternoons spent reading petitions from villages. Evenings when Alexander returned from training, still wearing his black armor, and found Eve beside the fire with a book. There had been no grand declarations between them. No sudden romance. Only something quieter. Alexander knocked before entering any room she occupied. He asked before sitting beside her. When nightmares woke her, he never demanded to know what she had dreamed. Somehow, those small things had become more dangerous to Eve's heart than anything dramatic could have been. Now one sentence brought Miller Manor rushing back. Why? She asked. Alexander placed a sealed document beside his plate. Your father requested an audience concerning tax relief. Eve almost laughed. Requested. Repeatedly. That sounds more like him. He also requested rooms for Margaret and Isabella. Her fingers tightened around the cup. Alexander noticed. He always noticed. I can refuse the visit. Eve looked up. You can. It is my castle. But they're my family. Those facts are unrelated. She lowered her gaze. Part of her wanted him to refuse. To send Richard's carriage back before it crossed the gates. But another part hated the thought that she still needed someone else to decide when she was strong enough to face them. Let them come. Alexander studied her. Are you certain? No, his expression softened almost invisibly. That appears to be becoming your preferred answer. Eve remembered saying the same thing before their wedding. A reluctant smile touched her lips. I'm learning from you. The following afternoon, the Miller carriage entered Blackwood courtyard beneath a pale winter sky. Eve waited at the top of the steps beside Alexander. She wore the same white medieval gown and silver-trimmed cloak she had arrived in. Alexander stood beside her in black armor, his dark royal cloak moving in the wind. Richard stepped from the carriage first. Margaret followed. Then Isabella. Eve had imagined this moment several times. She thought they might look relieved to see her healthy. Perhaps Margaret would ask how she had been treated. Perhaps Richard would notice she no longer looked frightened. Isabella climbed the steps and immediately said, "That dress again?" Eve's small hope disappeared. "Hello, Isabella." Her sister kissed the air beside her cheek. "I assumed a queen would have better clothes by now." Alexander's violet eyes shifted toward Isabella. Eve felt the temperature around them change despite the snow. "I like this dress," she said quickly. Alexander looked at her. "Then wear it." Isabella laughed lightly. She never had much taste. Alexander said nothing. Somehow his silence made Isabella's smile weaken. Richard bowed. "Your Majesty, we are grateful for your hospitality." Alexander's gaze settled on him. "You are here because my wife permitted the visit." Richard glanced at Eve as though the statement surprised him. Naturally. Inside, servants carried the Miller luggage toward the guest wing. Margaret removed her gloves and handed them toward Eve without looking. Eve caught them automatically. Her body reacted before her mind did. Years of habit. Take the gloves. Carry the cloak. Fetch the tea. Stay useful. She had already turned toward the servant corridor when Alexander spoke. "Evelyn." She stopped. His eyes dropped to the gloves in her hands. He did not order her. He did not embarrass Margaret. He simply waited. Eve looked down. Something inside her tightened. Margaret frowned. "Well? Put them in my room." Eve almost obeyed. Then she slowly handed the gloves back. "Mrs. Hale can have someone show you where they belong." Margaret stared at her. "Excuse me. Your room is in the eastern guest wing." Eve's heartbeat hammered, but she kept her voice steady. "A servant can assist you." Isabella gave a short laugh. "She has been here a month and already thinks she's royalty." Alexander's voice entered the corridor like a blade sliding from its sheath. "She does not think it." Everyone turned. He stood perfectly still, black armor catching the winter light from the windows. "She is." Isabella's face changed. Alexander continued, "You will address my wife with the respect owed to the Queen of Blackwood." Richard stepped forward. "Your Majesty, surely there is no need for formality among family." "Respect is not formality." His violet eyes moved to Richard. "And family is not an exemption from it." Eve could hear her pulse. No one had ever corrected them for her. Not once. Yet Alexander did not look triumphant. He simply looked certain. Dinner that evening was worse. Richard spoke almost exclusively about money. Border taxes. Trade exemptions. Military levies. Isabella complained that Blackwood Court had not invited her to the winter ball. Margaret commented twice on Eve's posture and once on her hair. Alexander listened without visible irritation until Richard finally leaned toward Eve. "You received my letter." "Yes." "Then you understand what we need." Eve placed her fork down. "You want additional tax relief. Our expenses have increased since your marriage." "How?" Richard's face tightened. "That is not your concern." The old Eve would have apologized. This Eve waited. Richard turned toward Alexander. "Your Majesty, surely Evelyn has explained that House Miller deserves consideration after surrendering a daughter to secure this alliance." Silence fell across the table. Alexander's hand stopped beside his glass. Eve saw his thumb press once against the stem. "Surrendering," he repeated. Richard seemed not to hear the warning. "We sacrificed considerably." Eve felt something cold open inside her. There it was again. Sacrifice. As though losing her had wounded them. As though they had not chosen her because Isabella was worth too much to lose. Alexander looked at Eve rather than her father. "Would you like me to answer him?" The question startled everyone. Eve most of all. Richard frowned. This is a matter between men. Alexander's eyes never left hers. Evelyn. She understood what he was doing. He could destroy Richard with one command. He could make the entire table bow. But he was not taking the moment from her. Eve inhaled slowly. No, she said. Alexander leaned back. Very well. Eve turned toward her father. You said you sacrificed me. Richard's expression hardened. We gave you a position most Omegas would beg for. You sold me because you wanted to keep your land. Margaret whispered sharply, Evelyn. Eve did not flinch this time. You chose me because Isabella was worth too much to lose. Isabella went pale. Richard pushed back his chair. Remember who you belong to. The words struck the room dead silent. Eve's old fear returned instantly, sharp and familiar. Then beneath the table, she felt warmth. Alexander's hand rested on the stone bench beside hers. Not touching. Not claiming. Simply there if she chose to reach for it. Eve looked at that scarred, powerful hand. Then at the man beside her. Alexander could command an entire kingdom, yet he was waiting for permission even now. Eve lifted her eyes to her father. That is the first thing you have said tonight that I understand completely. Richard's expression eased, mistaking her meaning. Eve continued. Because since coming here, I finally learned the answer. Her voice trembled once. Then steadied. I belong to no one. Across the table, Alexander Blackwood said nothing. But for the first time since her family arrived, the Ruthless Alpha King smiled. You will not speak to my wife as though she is property. Alexander's voice was quiet, but every candle flame along the dining table seemed to tremble with the silence that followed. Richard Miller remained standing beside his chair, his face flushed with anger. Margaret stared at Eve as if she had committed some unforgivable betrayal. Isabella looked between them, suddenly less amused than she had been minutes earlier. Eve could still hear her own words inside her head. I belong to no one. She had expected fear to follow them. Instead, something unfamiliar settled into her chest. Relief. Alexander had not spoken until after she had answered for herself. Even now, his hand remained beside hers on the stone bench without touching. Waiting. Eve slowly placed her fingers over his. His violet eyes flicked toward her. Nothing else changed in his expression, but his hand turned beneath hers, allowing their palms to meet. Richard noticed. Evelyn, he said sharply. You have forgotten yourself. Eve looked at him. No. I think I'm beginning to remember. Margaret inhaled. Your father sacrificed everything to give you this life. 30,000 silver crowns? Eve asked. 3 estates? Forgiven military penalties. Margaret's face tightened. Do not reduce family duty to numbers. Eve almost laughed. You put the numbers beside my name. Alexander's thumb moved once against her fingers. A small gesture. Steadying, not controlling. Richard looked toward him. Your Majesty, my daughter has always been emotional. She does not understand the responsibilities of leadership. Alexander's expression became cold. Your daughter understood that innocent villagers would be forced into labor if your debt remained unpaid. Richard went still. She asked about them before she signed. Alexander continued. Not about jewelry. Not about title. Not even about what Blackwood would give her personally. Her first concern was whether your people would suffer. Eve turned toward him. She had never told Alexander exactly what happened inside the Miller Council chamber. The royal envoy must have. That sounds remarkably like leadership to me, Alexander finished. Richard's face darkened. She is an Omega. Power shifted through the room. Eve felt it against her skin like distant thunder. Alexander's violet eyes brightened. And? One word. Richard's confidence faltered. I meant only that she was never trained to manage political matters. Then perhaps House Miller should be embarrassed that an untrained Omega recognized the consequences of your debt before you did. Isabella lowered her gaze. Eve should have felt satisfaction. Instead, she felt tired. She released Alexander's hand and stood. I'm finished with dinner. Alexander immediately rose. Eve shook her head gently. You don't have to come. He studied her face. Then nodded. Good night, Evelyn. No demand for explanation. No order to remain. Eve walked from the dining hall alone. She had nearly reached the eastern corridor when footsteps followed. Too heavy for Isabella. Too impatient for Margaret. Evelyn. She stopped. Richard approached quickly. What exactly do you think you're doing? Eve glanced toward the distant guards. They had noticed him, but she raised one hand. They remained where they were. Going to my room. Do not be clever. Richard lowered his voice. You embarrass me in front of the king. You embarrassed yourself. His hand closed around her upper arm. Eve froze. The reaction was immediate and humiliating. Her shoulders tightened. Her breath disappeared. For one terrible second, she was 16 again, standing inside Miller Manor while Richard reminded her that obedience was the only useful quality she possessed. We sold you to secure this family, he hissed. Everything you have now exists because we put you here. Never forget that. A shadow appeared at the end of the corridor. Alexander. Eve felt Richard's grip loosen before the Alpha King spoke. Alexander approached slowly, black armor dark beneath the torchlight. His face was expressionless. His violet eyes were not. Remove your hand. Richard released Eve immediately. Alexander stopped several feet away. He could have crossed that distance in a heartbeat. Eve knew it. Richard knew it too. Your Majesty, this is a private family matter. You are holding the Queen of Blackwood against her will inside my castle. Alexander's voice remained controlled. There is nothing private about that. Richard swallowed. She is my daughter. Alexander looked at Eve. Do you want me to answer him? The same question. Again. Eve stared at him. Alexander was powerful enough to end the confrontation with a command. Yet he was giving the choice back to her. No, she said softly. Then she faced Richard. Her arms still remembered his fingers, but she forced herself not to rub the place. You were right about one thing. Richard frowned. You did sell me. Alexander's gaze sharpened. Eve continued. But you were wrong about who bought me. Richard looked toward Alexander. Eve shook her head. He didn't. Silence. Alexander cut apart the terms you added without my consent. He gave me a room he cannot enter without permission. He asks before he speaks for me. He asks before he touches me. Her voice grew steadier with every sentence. You had 22 years to treat me like a person. The man you called a monster needed one afternoon. Richard's face lost color. Evelyn, you will not use me to obtain more land. You will not use my marriage to erase another debt. And you will never again tell me who I belong to. Richard looked past her toward Alexander. Are you going to allow her to speak to her father this way? Alexander's expression did not change. Allow her. The words were almost dangerously soft. You still do not understand. He stepped beside Eve, not in front of her. She does not require my permission to speak. Richard stared at them. For once, he had no answer. Eve turned toward the guards. Please escort Lord Miller back to the guest wing. The guards looked instinctively toward Alexander. Eve noticed. So did he. Alexander did not nod. He did not confirm her order. Instead, he looked at the guards and said, You heard your queen. Something inside Eve shifted. The guards bowed. Yes, Your Majesty. Richard was escorted away. Eve remained in the corridor, suddenly exhausted. Alexander stood beside her. Are you hurt? No, are you certain? Eve nodded. Then, after a moment, she whispered, I thought it would feel better. What? Standing up to him. Alexander looked down the corridor where Richard had disappeared. Sometimes freedom hurts before it feels like freedom. Eve turned toward him. There was no triumph in his face. Only understanding. How do you know that? Alexander was silent for a long moment. Because crowns are another thing people mistake for ownership. Eve wanted to ask what he meant, but Alexander stepped backward. You should rest. He started to leave. Alexander. He stopped. Eve crossed the space between them. For the first time, she was the one who reached first. Her fingers closed carefully around his hand. Alexander looked down at them, then at her. Thank you, she said. For defending you? Eve shook her head. For letting me defend myself. His violet eyes softened. You never needed me to give you that strength. Eve's throat tightened. Maybe not. Her fingers held his a little more firmly. But you were the first person who made it safe for me to find it. Alexander said nothing. He simply remained there, allowing her to choose how long to hold his hand. And for Evelyn Miller, that quiet choice felt more intimate than any wedding vow. Your father lied about the debt. Eve stared at Alexander across the council table. Morning light spilled through the high windows of Blackwood Castle, pale against the dark stone walls. Richard, Margaret, and Isabella had been ordered to remain in the guest wing after the confrontation the night before. Eve had expected another argument at breakfast. Instead, Alexander had asked her to meet him privately in the council chamber. Now 3 ledgers lay open between them. What do you mean? She asked. Alexander pushed the first ledger toward her. House Miller reported a crown debt of 30,000 silver crowns. That was the amount in my marriage contract. Yes. His finger moved to another column. But the actual debt was 18,000. Eve looked at the numbers. She read them twice. Then where did the other 12,000 come from? Alexander's jaw tightened. Your father. The room seemed to narrow around her. I don't understand. Richard demanded 30,000 as the settlement price. 12,000 was transferred into private accounts controlled by House Miller. Eve's fingers went cold against the parchment. He sold me for more than he owed. Alexander said nothing. He did not need to. Eve remembered her father telling her the entire pack would suffer if she refused. Margaret saying the marriage saved everyone. Isabella telling her not to come home if Alexander rejected her. 12,000 silver crowns. Eve slowly sat down. He made me believe villagers would lose everything. Some penalties were real, Alexander said. The threat was not entirely invented. But he used them. Yes. Eve looked at the third ledger. Several unfamiliar names appeared beneath House Miller's crust. Young women. Ages. Family deaths. Her stomach tightened. Who are they? Alexander did not answer immediately. That frightened her more than an immediate answer would have. Evelyn. Who are they? His violet eyes held hers. Omegas from Miller territory. She counted 6 names. The youngest was 18. Why are they listed beside amounts of silver? Alexander rested both hands against the table. My auditors intercepted correspondence between your father and 3 neighboring houses. Eve stopped breathing. No, Richard offered marriage contracts in exchange for clearing private debts. No, she pushed back from the table. The chair scraped sharply against stone. He can't. Not legally. Their families agreed? Some did. Alexander's voice hardened. Others appear to have been pressured. Eve turned away. Her hands trembled. She remembered standing outside the council chamber while her father decided which daughter was worth losing. She had believed the cruelty belonged specifically to her. Somehow, discovering it did not make everything worse. He was going to do it again. Alexander remained silent. After me. Yes. Eve covered her mouth. 6 girls. 6 doors. 6 families being told debt mattered more than choice. Why didn't you tell me last night? She whispered. Because you had just confronted your father. You were protecting me. I was giving you time. She looked at him. Is there a difference? There should be. Alexander stepped around the table but stopped several feet away. Always that distance. Always the space for her to decide. Protecting someone does not require controlling when they are allowed to know the truth. But timing can still be mercy. Eve looked back at the names. What happens to him? That depends partly on what we prove today. You are Queen of Blackwood. These women are now under your protection as much as mine. The words frightened her. Not because she did not want the responsibility. Because no one had ever trusted her with anything important unless they wanted something in return. Alexander opened another document. The Crown can freeze Miller assets immediately. But if Richard used marriage agreements to conceal debt trafficking, I need testimony or original contracts. Eve remembered something. His private study. Alexander waited. At Miller Manor. There's an iron cabinet behind the eastern bookshelf. Father never allowed anyone near it. How do you know? Because Isabella once lost a bracelet and accused a servant of stealing it. I searched everywhere before Father discovered me near the cabinet. Her voice faded. Alexander's eyes sharpened. What happened? Eve rubbed her wrist without realizing it. It doesn't matter. Alexander looked at the movement. He did not ask again. I can send investigators. Send Mrs. Hale's nephew. Alexander frowned. Daniel? He delivered winter medicine to Miller villages last year. The servants know him. They trust him. Alexander studied her for a moment. Good. Eve blinked. Good. You identified a witness route I missed. She stopped herself. Only helping. Only an Omega. Only Evelyn. Alexander seemed to recognize the unfinished sentence. Do not make yourself smaller after saying something intelligent. Heat touched her face. You make compliments sound like military orders. I am working on that. Despite everything, Eve almost smiled. The council doors opened before she could answer. Richard entered with 2 guards behind him. His face was furious. What is this? Alexander's expression became instantly unreadable. An investigation. Richard saw the ledgers. The color left his face. Eve noticed. That was enough. You lied to me, she said. Evelyn, you do not understand those accounts. Then explain them. This is Crown business. My name was used in the transaction. Richard looked toward Alexander. Control your wife. Silence fell. Eve watched Alexander's thumb stop against the edge of the table. Weeks earlier, that stillness would have frightened her. Now she understood it. He was angry enough to become careful. No, Alexander said. Richard blinked. No, I will not control her. Alexander looked at Eve instead. This is your question. Ask it. Eve faced her father. Did you inflate the debt before selling me? Richard's mouth tightened. Everything I did protected House Miller. Did you? A ruler makes difficult decisions. Eve pointed toward the list. And these women? For the first time, Richard looked uncertain. Their families owe money. So did you plan to sell them too? Marriage alliances are not slavery. Not when people choose them. Her voice remained quiet. Did they? Richard said nothing. Eve felt something inside her settle. Not anger. Certainty. Freeze the Miller accounts, she said. Richard laughed. You have no authority to. Alexander turned toward the royal clerk. Record the Queen's order. The clerk dipped his quill. Yes, Your Majesty. Richard stared at Eve. You would destroy your own family? Eve looked at the 6 names on the ledger. No, her blue eyes lifted to his. I'm stopping you from destroying 6 more. Guards moved beside Richard. His face twisted. You ungrateful little. Alpha power rolled through the chamber. Alexander had not moved, but violet light burned in his eyes. Richard fell silent. Eve looked at Alexander. He could end this with fear. Instead, he waited. For her. She turned to the guards. Take my father back to his rooms until the investigation is complete. Yes, Your Majesty. They escorted Richard away. When the doors closed, Eve's knees weakened. She caught the table. Alexander moved instinctively toward her, then stopped before touching her. Evelyn. She looked at his waiting hand. This time, she reached for it herself. His fingers closed around hers. Warm. Strong. Careful. I thought becoming free meant leaving my family behind, she whispered. Alexander's gaze remained on her. Sometimes it does. Eve looked at the 6 names again. And sometimes freedom means making sure they cannot build the same cage around someone else. Eve tightened her fingers around his hand. For 22 years, House Miller had taught her that power belonged to whoever could force another person to obey. Standing beside the most feared Alpha King in the realm, she was finally learning something different. Real power could also be the hand strong enough to command a kingdom and gentle enough to wait until she chose to take it. The first girl was supposed to be delivered next month. Eve stared at the 6 original contracts spread across the Blackwood Council table. Daniel Hale had returned from Miller territory shortly before dawn with the documents hidden inside a medicine wagon. Each parchment carried Richard Miller's seal. Each contained a young Omega's name, her family's debt, and the noble house willing to erase that debt in exchange for marriage. Eve's eyes stopped on the youngest. Clara Bennett. 18. Her father owed 900 silver crowns after 3 failed harvests. Beside Clara's name was a date. For weeks away. Eve's fingers curled against the table. Did she agree? Daniel lowered his eyes. Her mother says Clara was told the family would lose their farm if she refused. The room became painfully quiet. Alexander stood beside the window in black armor, his dark royal cloak falling from his shoulders. He had not interrupted once while Daniel gave his report. His violet eyes remained fixed on Eve. Waiting. Always waiting. And the others? She asked. Similar circumstances. Daniel indicated the remaining contracts. 2 families believed refusal would result in imprisonment for debt. Another was threatened with eviction. 1 girl apparently tried to run away. Eve swallowed. Did she escape? We found her at an aunt's cottage. Keep her there. Eve looked toward Alexander. Can we protect her? Yes. Without forcing her to come here? Something softened in his expression. Yes. Eve nodded. Then give her the choice. The words felt important when she said them. Perhaps because no one had given Eve that choice when the carriage arrived at Miller Manor. Daniel bowed. There is more, Your Majesty. He placed a smaller ledger on the table. Lord Miller's private accounts. Eve recognized her father's handwriting immediately. Alexander crossed the room and opened the ledger beside her. Payments had been recorded under false categories: road repairs, grain purchases, border maintenance. But Daniel had marked corresponding transfers from noble houses. Eve followed the numbers until she reached the payment connected to her own marriage. 12,000 silver crowns. Not crown debt. Not village relief. Richard's private reserve. Her stomach turned. Where's the money? Alexander asked. Most remains in accounts controlled by Miller agents. Some was spent. On what? Daniel hesitated. Eve already knew she would hate the answer. Lady Isabella's proposed dowry. Renovations to Miller Manor. Imported horses. Jewelry. Eve stared at the page. Her family had told her she was saving starving villagers. They had used part of her price to buy Isabella jewelry. She expected anger. Instead came a strange emptiness. Evelyn. Alexander's voice was low. She closed the ledger. I want to see him. You do not have to. I know. That was exactly why she wanted to. An hour later, Richard stood before the royal council. Margaret and Isabella had been brought with him. For once, Isabella wore no amused smile. The 6 contracts rested openly on the table. Richard looked at them and immediately understood. Those were private agreements. Eve remained seated beside Alexander. Agreements with women who did not consent. Their families consented. Their families are not marrying those men. Margaret stepped forward. Evelyn, enough. Whatever mistakes your father made, humiliating him publicly accomplishes nothing. Eve looked at her stepmother. Did you know? Margaret's silence lasted half a second too long. Did you know? Eve repeated. I knew he was arranging marriages. Did you know the families were being threatened? Your father manages financial matters. Isabella spoke suddenly. Why are you acting like you care about those girls? You never even met them. Eve turned toward her sister. Neither had Alexander met me when he cut the terms father added to my contract. Isabella's expression changed. Eve continued, apparently, you do not need to know someone personally to believe they deserve a choice. Richard slammed his palm against the table. Eve flinched. Only slightly. But Alexander saw it. His violet eyes brightened. Eve placed one hand over his before he could rise. Alexander looked at her. She shook her head. He remained seated. Richard noticed the exchange. You think this makes you powerful? He demanded. Sitting beside him? Wearing a crown? Giving orders because the Alpha King allows it. The old words tried to find their old wounds. Eve let them arrive. Then let them pass. No, she stood. I think power is what you do when someone cannot stop you. Richard frowned. You had power over me for 22 years. Her voice remained quiet. Alexander had more power over me in the first hour I arrived here than you ever did. She looked at the man beside her. And the first thing he did with it was remove a clause I never agreed to. Silence settled across the chamber. Eve turned back to Richard. That is the difference between you. Richard's face hardened. I am your father. Then you should have been the first man to teach me I could not be bought. She pushed the contracts toward the royal clerk. Cancel every agreement. The clerk looked at Alexander. Alexander's gaze remained on Eve. The Queen has spoken. Yes, Your Majesty. The clerk gathered the documents. Eve continued. Return every payment taken from those families. Any debt created through coercion is suspended until the Crown reviews it. Richard laughed bitterly. With whose money? Eve looked at the private ledger. Mine. Everyone went still. Alexander's brow tightened. Evelyn. She faced him. The 12,000 silver father received because of my marriage. It legally belongs to House Miller until the fraud ruling is complete. Then when it is seized? Alexander understood. You want it transferred to the victims. Not to me. Eve looked at the 6 names. Use it to clear their debts. Whatever remains should create a fund for Omegas trying to leave forced agreements. Margaret stared at her. You would give away your own settlement? Eve almost smiled. It was never mine. Then why? Eve touched the dark silver wedding ring on her finger. Because I know what it feels like to believe there is nowhere else to go. No one answered. Richard was escorted from the chamber pending judgment. Margaret followed in stunned silence. Isabella remained near the doors. She looked back at Eve with something unfamiliar in her eyes. Not contempt. Perhaps shame. Were you really that unhappy with us? She asked. Eve's chest tightened. Once, she would have softened the truth to protect Isabella from it. Yes. Isabella looked down and left. The doors closed. Eve stood motionless. Alexander approached, but stopped before touching her. You could keep the seized money, he said. I don't want to become rich because someone put a price on me. Then what do you want? Eve looked at him. The answer frightened her because it was no longer about survival. I want those women to know they can leave. Alexander nodded. Then we build somewhere for them to go. We. One small word. Eve's eyes burned. You would do that? You are asking me to protect people who have been denied a choice. His expression softened. You should know my answer by now. Eve smiled through the tears threatening her vision. Then she crossed the final step between them and wrapped her arms around him. Alexander froze. The most feared Alpha King in the realm stood completely motionless because Eve had never embraced him before. You can touch me, she whispered. His arms came around her carefully. Not possession. Not command. Just warmth. Eve rested her cheek against his black armor and listened to his heartbeat. For years, her family had taught her that love meant proving how much she was willing to surrender. Standing in Alexander's arms, Eve finally understood why his kindness had frightened her so deeply. He had never asked her to surrender anything. And somewhere between the locked bedroom door, the broken vase, and the hand that always waited for hers, Evelyn had begun to love the man everyone else called ruthless.